Michael Robinson sat at his kitchen table, the early morning light spilling through the cracked blinds. The air smelled of stale coffee and the faint whiff of the bacon he burned the day before, just another reminder of how his life had shifted from controlled chaos to mundane chaos. He glanced at his worn-out wristwatch, a relic from his old life, and muttered under his breath, "Damn thing's older than my kid. Works better too." Michael was 42 but felt at least 60. He had that kind of weathered look, a mix of tired eyes and a jawline that seemed carved out of determination. Once upon a time, he wore tailored suits and carried a badge that commanded respect. Now he was the guy people called when their lives hit rock bottom and they needed a shovel to start digging up. He didn't mind, though. After leaving the FBI, being a public defender gave him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Sure, it paid peanuts, and yeah, most of his clients treated him like a vending machine for legal advice, but it was honest work. Michael's phone buzzed, dragging him out of his thoughts. He picked it up with the same enthusiasm one reserves for unpaid bills. The text was from his client, Jaden Carter, a 22-year-old black kid accused of a crime that stank worse than a week-old fish market. The charges? Theft. The evidence? Flimsy, at best. And the accuser? Chief Douglas Gray, the poster boy for white privilege, in a badge and uniform. "Hey, Mr. Robinson," the text read. "I am outside the courthouse. You coming?" Michael sighed, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to tell Jaden to relax, that they had a solid case, but he also knew that calming someone down with a text was about as effective as putting out a forest fire with a garden hose. Instead, he typed, "On my way. Sit tight." The courthouse stood like a grim monolith in the middle of town, its gray exterior matching the mood inside. Michael parked his beat-up Chevy 2 blocks away, not because he cared about the parking fee, but because he liked the walk. It gave him time to think, to strategize, and frankly, to brace himself for whatever fresh hell awaited him in that building. Jaden was waiting on the courthouse steps, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie. The kid looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Michael couldn't blame him. The system had a way of making you feel guilty, even when you knew you weren't. "Morning, Jaden," Michael greeted, his voice steady and calm, the way a lifeguard talks to someone about to drown. "Yeah, if you can call this morning," Jaden replied, his eyes darting around nervously. "I feel like everyone's staring at me." Michael glanced at the crowd milling about. "They're not staring at you. They're staring at this circus we're walking into. Trust me, kid, you are just the opening act." Jaden cracked a small, hesitant smile. "You always this funny?" "Only when I am underpaid," Michael shot back, leading the way inside. The courtroom smelled like old wood and bad decisions. Michael took his seat at the defense table, while Jaden sat beside him, fidgeting like a kid waiting for a dentist appointment. Across the room sat Chief Gray, flanked by his legal team. The man was a walking stereotype, buzz-cut, clean-shaven, and an expression that screamed, "I've never been wrong in my life." Michael locked eyes with him for a brief moment. Gray smirked, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. Michael resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He'd dealt with men like Gray before, guys who thought a badge made them gods, and the law was just their playbook. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Judge Wilson, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, took her seat at the bench. Michael liked her. She was fair, sharp, and had a knack for sniffing out bullshit. He'd need that today because Gray and his team were about to unload a truckload of it. The prosecution opened with their usual theatrics, painting Jaden as some kind of criminal mastermind. Michael listened, his expression blank, but his mind racing. Every accusation felt like a punch to the gut, not just for Jaden, but for every kid like him who'd been dragged into the system for no good reason. When it was Michael's turn, he stood up and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by saying this. If my client were guilty, I wouldn't be here. I'd be at home, drinking a cold beer and watching the game." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Gray's smirk faltered. Michael pressed on, his voice steady but firm. Jaden Carter is not a thief. He's a young man who's been wrongfully accused by a system that's too quick to judge and too slow to listen. And today, we're going to prove that. During a recess, Michael stepped outside to catch his breath. The sun was shining, but it felt fake, like a spotlight in a cheap play. He leaned against a pillar, his mind replaying every detail of the case. He couldn't shake the feeling that Gray was hiding something. The man was too smug, too sure of himself. As Michael lit a cigarette, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You know those things will kill you, right?" He turned to see an old colleague from his FBI days, a woman named Lisa. She was dressed in plain clothes, but her posture and the way she scanned the crowd screamed law enforcement. "Lisa," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke, "what brings you to this little slice of paradise?" "Let's just say I have a vested interest in this case," she replied, her tone cryptic. Michael frowned. "What kind of interest?" Lisa gave him a look that sent a chill down his spine. "Let's just say you are not the only one who wants to see Gray fall. Be careful, Mike. He plays dirty." Michael watched her walk away, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar buzz of danger, the kind that made his skin tingle and his instincts sharpen. As he crushed his cigarette underfoot, he muttered to himself, "Well, shit. This just got interesting." Michael sat back at the defense table, drumming his fingers on the scarred wood. The courtroom had the kind of tense silence that made you feel like you'd stepped into the middle of a bar fight, just waiting for the first bottle to shatter. Jaden sat next to him, eyes darting between the jury box and Chief Gray, who was holding court at the plaintiff's table like he was some kind of mob boss in uniform. "Relax," Michael muttered under his breath. "If you look guilty, they're going to think you are. Just breathe and sit still. You are making me look bad." Jaden gave a nervous laugh, leaning in. "Man, I am trying, but every time that guy looks at me, it's like he's picturing me in cuffs." Michael shot a glance at Gray, who sat with his arms crossed, radiating smugness like it was his default setting. Let him stare. Just means he's sweating, even if he won't show it. The prosecution called their star witness, an officer who, based on his testimony, must have spent the last week memorizing his lines. The guy had the kind of rehearsed tone that screamed, "I am lying through my teeth, but it's for a good cause." Officer Richards, the prosecutor began, pacing in front of the jury like he was auditioning for a daytime drama. "Can you tell us what you observed the night of the alleged theft?" "Of course," Richards said, his voice steady. "I was patrolling the area when I saw Mr. Carter acting suspiciously near the storefront. He seemed nervous." Michael shot up from his seat. "Objection. Unless this officer has a degree in mind reading, his interpretation of my client's mood is irrelevant." Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow. Sustained. "Officer Richards, stick to the facts." Richards shifted uncomfortably but continued, spinning a tale that would have made a crime novelist proud. According to him, Jaden was practically waving a neon sign that said, "I did it." Michael waited patiently, jotting down notes as the officer dug himself deeper into his fictional hole. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Michael stood and adjusted his tie, the kind of deliberate move that said, "Get ready, this is going to sting." "Officer Richards," he began, his voice calm but sharp. "You claim to have seen my client acting suspiciously. Can you define that for us? Was he walking funny? Whispering to a ghost? Practicing his evil laugh?" The courtroom chuckled, and Richard's face flushed. "He was loitering," the officer stammered. "Loitering," Michael repeated, nodding thoughtfully. "So, if I stand outside a store and check my phone, that's suspicious behavior? Because if that's the case, I am surprised you are not arresting half the city." Richards opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Michael pounced. "And let's talk about this alleged theft. You didn't actually see my client take anything, did you?" "No, but..." "No buts, officer. You didn't see it, and yet here we are. Thank you for your time. Michael sat down, his tone dripping with finality. The break between testimonies was a welcome relief. Michael needed air, and the courthouse corridors were a poor substitute for the real thing. He paced near the vending machines, his mind racing. Gray was up to something, could feel it in his gut. The man's confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was the kind of assuredness that came with knowing you had a card up your sleeve. Michael. A voice behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to see Lisa again, her expression unreadable. What now? He asked, rubbing his temples. If you are here to drop more cryptic warnings, let me save you the trouble you already know. This case is a dumpster fire. Lisa crossed her arms. You are missing the bigger picture. Gray isn't just after this kid. He's trying to make an example of anyone who questions his authority. That includes you. Michael snorted. Oh, good. I was worried this would be boring. Lisa stepped closer, lowering her voice. I mean it, Mike. This isn't just about a petty theft case. Gray's got skeletons in his closet, and he'll bury anyone who gets too close. Michael stared at her for a long moment. You are telling me this now, during the case? She shrugged. Better late than never. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more charged. The prosecution rested their case, and now it was Michael's turn to present the defense. He stood, taking a moment to let the silence stretch, like a magician setting up his big reveal. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, addressing the jury. You've heard a lot of talk today, a lot of accusations, assumptions, and frankly, some creative storytelling. But here is the thing. None of it proves my client is guilty. What we have here is a case built on bias, not facts. He turned to Jaden. This young man isn't a criminal. He's a target, plain and simple. And you know why? Because it's easier to blame him than to do real police work. Gray shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering. Michael pressed on. We're going to prove Jaden's innocence, not with wild accusations, but with real evidence. And when we're done, you'll see this case for what it really is. A farce. As Michael sat down, he glanced at Gray, whose face was a mask of barely contained anger. Whatever the chief had planned, it was clear he hadn't expected Michael to come out swinging. The tension in the room was palpable. Michael could feel the storm brewing, but he kept his expression neutral. Inside, though, he was ready. Let the bastard make his move, he thought. I am ready for him. Конец второй части. The courtroom buzzed with the energy of a live wire, everyone hanging on the edge of their seats. You could practically taste the tension in the air, bitter and metallic, like blood in your mouth after a bad punch. Michael leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes locked on Chief Gray, who was doing his best impression of someone completely unbothered. But Michael could see it, the tight grip on the armrests, the slight twitch in his jaw. Gray was unraveling. It was time to bring in the defense's star witness, the kind of witness who doesn't just poke holes in a case but rips it apart like a wolf tearing into raw meat. Michael glanced at Jaden, giving him a nod. This is it, kid. Stay calm and let me do my thing. The bailiff called for the witness, and in walked a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air about her. Her name was Margaret Hale, a retired schoolteacher and Jaden's neighbor. Margaret wasn't just an alibi. She was the alibi. She'd been with Jaden that night, helping him care for his grandmother, who'd been struggling with late-stage dementia. As Margaret took the stand, Michael stood and adjusted his tie. He approached her with the confidence of a man who'd been through the ringer and come out sharper on the other side. Mrs. Hale, Michael began, his voice calm and reassuring. Can you tell the court where you were on the night of the alleged theft? I was at home, next door to Jaden, she said firmly. He was with me the entire evening. And why was he with you? He helps me take care of my mother, she replied. She's bedridden, and I can't do it alone. That night, he was there helping me prepare her dinner, giving her her medication, and keeping her company. Michael nodded, letting her words hang in the air. Then he turned to the jury. So while the prosecution would have you believe my client was out committing a crime, He was actually being a compassionate, responsible young man. Quite the contrast, wouldn't you say? Gray shifted in his seat, his face turning a shade darker. Michael smirked inwardly. He wasn't done yet. The cross-examination was as predictable as bad reality television. The prosecutor tried to discredit Margaret, implying her memory might not be reliable given her age. Michael was on his feet before the question was fully out of the man's mouth. "Objection," he snapped. "Are we really going to attack a woman who spent her life educating children and caring for her family just because her testimony doesn't fit your narrative?" The judge waved her hand. Sustained. Michael sat down, giving the prosecutor a look that said, "Try harder." The session broke for lunch, and Michael found himself outside again, leaning against the courthouse wall with a cigarette between his fingers. Lisa appeared out of nowhere, her expression grim. "You are playing with fire, Mike," she said, crossing her arms. "Gray's losing control, and that makes him dangerous." Michael exhaled a plume of smoke, watching it drift into the crisp afternoon air. "Dangerous how?" Lisa glanced around, lowering her voice. "Word is, he's been making threats. He's not just pissed about this case, he's scared. If you push him too far." Michael cut her off. "Lisa, I've been dealing with bullies like Gray my whole career. They puff out their chests and act tough, but the second you hit back, they crumble. Trust me, I've got this." Lisa didn't look convinced, but she let it go. "Just watch your back." Michael flicked his cigarette to the ground, grinding it out with his shoe. "Always do." Back in the courtroom, things were heating up. Margaret's testimony had struck a nerve, and it showed. Gray looked like a man on the verge of losing his cool, and Michael was counting on it. The prosecution called its final witness another officer who claimed to have additional evidence against Jaden. As the man took the stand, Michael noticed a bead of sweat rolling down Gray's temple. He leaned over to Jaden. "Watch this," Michael whispered. "This is where it gets interesting." The officer produced a grainy security camera photo, supposedly showing Jaden near the crime scene. Michael stared at the image, then back at the officer. "Really? This is your smoking gun? That could be anyone with a hoodie and a bad posture." The officer stiffened. "It matches the description we were given." Michael leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. "Let me guess. The description was young black male, wearing a hoodie. Because if that's the case, congratulations. You've just described half the city." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Gray slammed his fist on the table, drawing everyone's attention. "Enough of this circus," he bellowed, his face flushed. "This kid is guilty, and you know it." Michael stood slowly, his eyes locking onto Gray's. "Your Honor, I'd like that last outburst entered into the record. Seems like the chief here has already decided my client's guilt, despite the lack of evidence." The judge nodded, her face stern. "Noted. Chief Gray, control yourself, or I'll hold you in contempt." Michael smirked, feeling the momentum shift. Gray was cracking, and it was only a matter of time before he made a fatal mistake. But Michael wasn't about to let his guard down. He knew this game wasn't over not by a long shot. As the judge adjourned for the day, Michael packed up his files, his mind already racing with strategies for the next round. Jaden leaned in, his voice low. "You think we're winning?" Michael clapped him on the shoulder. "Kid, this isn't about winning. This is about surviving. And trust me, we're damn good at that." As they walked out, Michael felt that the storm was coming, and he was ready to meet it head-on. The courtroom was a boiling pot ready to overflow. The audience, the jury, even the bailiff, everyone could feel it. The tension was thick enough to choke on, and Michael Robinson sat at the defense table like the eye of the storm, calm and calculating. His sharp gaze darted to Chief Gray, whose face was a cocktail of rage and desperation. Michael had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who knew his house of cards was about to collapse. Jaden leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "What happens now?" Michael didn't break his focus. Now, we make them sweat. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecutor stood to deliver his closing arguments. It was the usual song and dance, a symphony of thinly veiled bias wrapped in lawful language. Michael barely listened. His attention was on Gray, who was fidgeting in his chair, a telltale sign that the man was barely holding it together. When the prosecutor finally sat down, Michael rose, buttoning his jacket with deliberate slowness. His steps to the center of the courtroom were measured, his presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the jury, "you've been asked to believe a story that's flimsier than a dollar store umbrella in a hurricane. My client, Jaden Carter, is innocent. Not probably innocent, not maybe innocent, but absolutely innocent. And do you know why? Because the so-called evidence against him is nothing but smoke and mirrors." He turned to the prosecution's table. And who's holding the mirrors? Chief Douglas Gray. The room went dead silent. Gray's face twisted into a sneer, but he stayed seated for now. Michael continued, his voice rising with conviction. "This entire case isn't about justice. It's about power. It's about a man who thinks his badge makes him untouchable. But today, we're here to remind him that no one is above the law." As Michael sat back down, he noticed Gray muttering to himself. The chief was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater in a washing machine. When the judge asked if the prosecution had any rebuttal, Gray stood up before his lawyer could stop him. "Your Honor," Gray started, his voice shaking with poorly disguised fury. "This whole case is a damn joke. That kid is guilty, and we all know it." The judge slammed her gavel. "Chief Gray, sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt." But Gray wasn't listening. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun. The room erupted into chaos screams, gasps, the jury scrambling like mice in a flood. Gray pointed the weapon at Michael, his hand trembling. "You think you are so smart, Robinson?" Gray snarled. "You think you can ruin me?" Michael didn't flinch. He locked eyes with Gray, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Put the gun down, Douglas. You are only making this worse for yourself." Gray's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Worse? My career's already over, thanks to you." And that's when it happened. Quick as lightning, Michael moved. Years of AI training kicked in, his body reacting faster than his mind. He lunged forward, grabbing Gray's wrist and twisting it with precise force. The gun clattered to the floor, and with a swift maneuver, Michael had Gray's arm pinned behind his back. The courtroom stared in stunned silence as Michael slammed Gray onto the table, holding him there. "Guess what, Chief?" Michael said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You just proved my point." The bailiff and two officers rushed over, cuffing Gray and hauling him away. The once mighty police chief now looked like a man stripped of all his power. The judge called for order, her gavel pounding like a drumbeat in the chaos. "Court is adjourned," she declared. "Mr. Robinson, my chambers know." Michael nodded, still catching his breath. He glanced at Jaden, who looked like he'd just survived a hurricane. "Kid," Michael said, patting his shoulder, "you are free. This circus is over." Later that afternoon, Michael sat in the judge's chambers, his tie loosened and a glass of water in his hand. Judge Wilson paced the room, her stern expression softened just slightly. "Michael," she began, "that was one hell of a performance out there. But I have to ask, how the hell did you move like that?" Michael gave her a sly smile. "Let's just say I've had some training." The judge raised an eyebrow. "FBI?" Michael tilted his head, guilty as charged. Judge Wilson let out a rare laugh, shaking her head. "Well, you certainly know how to keep a courtroom entertained." The fallout was swift and brutal. Gray was charged with multiple counts, including assault with a deadly weapon and obstruction of justice. The media had a field day, painting Michael as a hero and Gray as a cautionary tale of unchecked power. Jaden was officially exonerated, and Michael returned to his office, ready for his next case. But something had shifted. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from an old contact at the bureau. "We could use you back, Robinson. Think about it." Michael stared at the screen, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not today," he muttered, tossing the phone onto his desk. For now, he was content. Because sometimes, justice didn't need a badge, just someone who wasn't afraid to stand up and fight.